Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this Ius Laboris webinar. My name is Annie and I will be facilitating the session for you today. So today's presentation will be given by a set of panelists, all from different member firms of Ius Laboris. We have lawyers from the UK, Canada, US, and France joining the panel today. Okay, that's all from me. I will now turn over to Lucy to start the session. Go ahead, Lucy.
Many thanks, Annie, and welcome to all of you to this webinar looking at the impact of COVID-19 on diversity and inclusion. And as yesterday was International Women's Day, we really want to look at that through the lens of gender. So we're going to be using gender, but also exploring some of the other ways that diversity and inclusion has been impacted. I'm delighted to be joined by fantastic colleagues, as you say, from across the world. So Herbert Law from Mathews Dinsdale in Canada. He's going to be exploring unconscious bias. Dawn Seiler Nixon from FordHarrison in the US. She's going to be looking at whether COVID has had a negative net impact on women in the workplace. And Fadi Sphere from Capstan in France is going to be looking at affirmative action or positive discrimination. And I'm going to be looking and exploring data and diversity transparency and whether COVID-19 will impact that. So a lot to get through. Before we come to Herbert, I just wanted to say a little bit about a report that Ius Laboris has prepared, and perhaps Annie, we could start the presentation. Thank you. So Ius Laboris has prepared this really fantastic report. It's called The Word 2021, The Forces for Change. It's available on the website. I'd really encourage you to download and read, review it, share it. It includes information, and some of that you can see on the screen now. So Ius Laboris undertook some research. They spoke to over 500 clients across 25 countries, looking at the impact of COVID-19. And one of the areas of impact they looked at was diversity and inclusion, looking at how diversity and inclusion have been impacted by the pandemic and whether that made a difference depending on the size of organization that you are, and then looking forward and looking ahead, whether diversity and inclusion is going to be impacted as we come out of the pandemic. But the report looks at lots of other things too. It looks at the broader changes that have been. What will a return to a new normal look like? So, for example, 38% of people polled think that some of the changes accelerated by COVID-19 are going to be really positive for the workplace. And as well as diversity and inclusion, it picks up some of those really challenging topics. So looking at, for example, what is remote working going to look and feel like after the pandemic? Will that differ between countries? Is it possible to have a global approach to that? And then a really challenging thing for employers has been managing mental health. An employer's response to mental health has been critical through this pandemic. And it's certainly the case that managing mental health, but more broadly well-being, is going to be a very, very important part of workplace employer-employee relations going forward. All of that and much, much more is available in the report. So The Word 2021, Forces for Change, really fascinating, and would encourage everybody that gets a chance to download it. But Herbert, I'll hand over to you, and we'll start by looking at unconscious bias.
Thank you, Lucy. And so I will share with you some of our experiences from Canada as it relates to diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias. As many of you know, Canada is a very diverse and multicultural country. Approximately 22% of Canada's population identifies itself as being part of a visible minority group. And this proportion is only going to rise by 2036. Statistics Canada estimates about 25 to 30% of the Canadian population will be from a racialized group. And in general, Canadians hold a favorable view on immigration, and the federal government has announced that this year their goal is to admit approximately 400,000 new permanent residents, and that this number will only rise to approximately 420,000 new permanent residents by 2023, and that's a per year number. And you have to take into consideration that that's for a population of only about 37.5 million people. So notwithstanding all this, and I'm taking this back to the issues of diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias, like many other westernized countries, there is still underrepresentation of women and racialized workers in senior management and management positions. For instance, and these are just quick statistics, only about 36% of managers are women, and only about 29% of senior managers are women, and that's a similar statistic to racialized individuals. And the question really is like, what is the cause of this historical underrepresentation? And one of these causes may be unconscious biases, and unconscious biases and are the implicit biases that a lot of us, may share, and they may be based on our beliefs, social norms, past interactions, and other factors. Unconscious biases affect how we perceive and interact with people and social groups, and influence our decision making and behavior. And it's important that human resource professionals understand that unconscious biases exist and how to address it within their organization. So I'm going to quickly go through some human resource considerations that employers might want to consider. A common answer to addressing unconscious biases is to do training, and it's important to do this training both for human resource practitioners and for people managers. And how would this training look like? I think it's important that human resource practitioners understand that intentional biases exist, and that we can't address it without acknowledging that they exist. And these biases is more likely to occur when you make fast decisions or act on a spur of the moment, i.e. you don't take into consideration candidates or employees' particular circumstances and understand that cultural norms may be different when compared to your own. It's also important to pay attention to biases that relate to protected human rights grounds, such as, as we've talked about, race, sex, disabilities, religion, etc., as these may result in potential legal liabilities for your organization. And it's very important to make sure that, when taking into unconscious biases, when you implement, positive change, that, ultimately we interact with our team, more openly, and we engage our team such that, all our team members have a fair hearing and have an equal chance to give their opinions and contributions. And this, takes into consideration that cultural and gender differences within an organization or a team. For instance, women team members may need to be given more opportunities to share their contributions when compared to men. How would you get buy-in for this? Because it's not surprising that, there's going to be resistance. There's going to be members of the organization who would consider some of these initiatives to infringe on, merit-based issues or merit considerations. And I think the easiest way to convince employers or organizations to buy in is clients now demand service providers to have direct diversity and inclusion initiatives. And this is especially true for institutional and multinational clients. And there's also a noticeable shift in the last couple of years about diversity and inclusion, both for gender and racial equality, spurred from the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And finally, often diverse workforces lead to more productive and profitable workforces. And so I'm going to go to the collection of demographic data. How do we get there? And one way an organization may get to creating a diverse workforce is to start collecting demographic data. And because demographic data is helpful to measure the company's success in addressing diversity and inclusion issues. In Ontario, the Human Rights Commission actually endorses the collection of demographic data because it's essential in creating a strong human rights and human resource strategy where an organization will be able to verify, monitor, and measure, and also address gaps within the organization. It can also lead to an organizing attracting, retaining, and motivating a diverse and well-qualified workforce. There are some cons in relying too much on demographic data as well. And these cons that employers ought to consider is that there may be an increased focus on statistics instead of addressing the underlying driving forces for unconscious biases. And there may be criticisms leveled against the employer for trying to meet quotas instead of focusing on hiring the best person for the job. Which leads me to the last point I wanted to make is how do you address arguments that diversity and inclusion initiatives undermine the merit principle? And so I think we can all agree that a fair recruitment system should recruit the best person for the job. But the question really is, what is the best person? And are we, question we all have to ask ourselves is, are we measuring merit fairly? Are we giving greater weight to certain characteristics of a candidate and giving less weight to certain characteristics? And the underlying question that we have to look at is we have to remove any cultural biases or gender biases, or at least acknowledge it so that the employer may be able to better assess members of a diverse group in a broader definition of merit. And ultimately, this is not an easy fix. It will require human resource practitioners, in part to dive in to particular positions and particular problems, but ultimately, with hard work, hopefully it would result in a more diverse team. I think that may be my time. So I'm going to move on to asking some questions for my colleagues. In how each particular country deals with unconscious bias. So Lucy, in the UK, how can you limit the risk of a claim of unconscious bias?
It's similar, actually, Herbert, to you in Canada. So we've had this view that training is very important, just as you have described. There's a defence to a discrimination claim in the UK if you can show you took all reasonable steps to avoid the discrimination. In this case, we're talking about unconscious bias from occurring. And generally, employers have used training to do that. It's been really interesting because there's been a very intense debate about whether training works, and it's been prompted by the UK government. The UK government have announced that they're going to stop their unconscious bias training for the civil service. And they say there's currently no evidence that this unconscious bias training changes behaviour in the long term or improves workplace equality in terms of representation of women, ethnic minorities, or other ethnic groups. And that's intensified this debate. But we still tell our clients that training is really important. It's a really important way of realising that defence, so mitigating risk in litigation. If you do training, it's really important that the training is up to date and you've taken some effort to assess the value of that, assess whether it's really working. In other words, it's not just a tick box exercise. There's been a recent appeal case in the UK that looked at training in the context of this defence and said, well, look, if the training becomes stale, or if you don't assess at all whether it's actually working, you won't be able to rely on the defence. So training on unconscious bias remains really, really important in the UK, and it is still a good way to mitigate risk and liability in a claim. Back to you.
Thank you, Lucy. So I'm going to move on to Fadi. In France, how do you address unconscious bias?
Thank you, Herbert, and hello, everyone. Actually, you mentioned earlier in your presentation, Herbert, demographics, and the problem we have in France is that actually In terms of ethnicity, we're not really allowed to have ethnic statistics. That's because we're not allowed to make a difference between citizens based on ethnicity. That means that we have an issue here is that we cannot measure the problem, and it's hard to fix a problem you cannot measure. So, well, that being said, we still have tools in place, and one of them, which you mentioned, with both of you, Lucy and Herbert mentioned, is training, and we have an obligation to train against discrimination in all companies above 300 employees. At the same time, the matter is obviously often mentioned in public debate, which is a good thing. We have a big debate going on with regards to discriminatory bias in the police, for instance. Which is being debated at the moment, and also media awareness is rising with regard to this matter, which is also a very good thing. The National Ombudsman is working on this, as she recently launched an online platform in which you can report any case of discrimination, and the Ombudsman has a name and shame prerogative, and also can appear before court to give her opinion. One interesting point is the anonymous resume. There used to be an obligation under French law to have anonymous resume in the recruitment process, which would have been, on that point, really an interesting tool. The problem is that this obligation was subject to a decree for it to be implemented, and actually the decree never came. The obligation was never implemented, and it is now repealed, which means it was never actually used. That would have been an interesting tool to measure the discriminatory bias, the unconscious bias in terms of recruitment, for instance. Another example, which is interesting, is last year, because of COVID, they for admission in public schools, for public servants. You couldn't do admissions in person. You couldn't do an oral exam, so they replaced it with a written exam, and also they examined at the file of the applicants, and they found actually that women were more approved for the process last year compared to the previous years. So that's also an interesting fact. That's for France. I'll move over to you, Herbert.
Thank you, Fadi. That's very interesting. Don, I'm moving to the US now. How does categorization relate to unconscious bias, and what is the impact in the workplace?
Thank you, Herbert. It's very interesting that we're talking about these requirements for training, because the US does not have a specific requirement for training, but one of the things that I'm finding a lot of is that employers are engaging us to provide them with unconscious bias training, especially since our prior administration implemented an executive order that gave the impression that that training was not allowed. And so our current administration has repealed that order, and there's been a lot of unconscious bias training. And part of what I talk about is this issue of categorization. It's something that we're taught to do as early as age 3, and it allows us to make sense of information, but it also leads to stereotyping, and that stereotyping can then lead to discrimination, which is a violation of our laws. And so, that's one of the things that we're trying to focus individuals on when we're talking about unconscious bias, because here as kids, we're told to, put things together in, groups, right? And we play this game, one of these things doesn't look like the other. And so that's what we do in our mind as adults. When we see someone, we're putting them in these small little boxes based on their culture or their heritage or their gender, and then we're stereotyping them based on those boxes. And then ultimately that could lead to discrimination. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. Herbert?
Thank you. So I think now we're moving on to our next topic, transparency in the workplace and gender and other pay gaps.
Yeah, thanks, Herbert. And I'm going to lead on this because data and diversity and data reporting has become a a big topic in the UK. Many of you will know that we have gender pay gap reporting in the UK, and that's mandatory for businesses with more than 250 employees. We've been expecting that that threshold to reduce, and possibly if it hadn't been for COVID, it would have been. Data reporting has been impacted by COVID. I'll say a little bit about that. But in the UK, you use a snapshot date. So you take a date in April and you look at everybody paid at that date. And because people are paid in different ways, shift work, annualized hours work, part-time work, there's a formula to calculate everybody's pay as an hourly rate. And then you have to report a number of things. So the first thing you have to report is the pay across the spectrum. So your lowest hourly rate to your highest hourly rate. And then you separate the pay into quartiles. And you have to say then the percentage of men and women in each quartile. And the purpose of that is to identify whether you've got a lot of women in lower paid jobs. And as you take steps to address your pay gap, you would expect to see those proportions change. You then report your sort of more standard pay gap data, so the average and the median pay gap. And then the UK government were very focused on people not being able to get around pay gap reporting by moving sums of money into bonus related pay. So we have this very wide definition of bonus, which really includes any financial benefit. And you also need to report in relation to bonus. So the percentage of men and women that received a bonus, and then the average, the mean and the median bonus pay gap. Employers are in the UK are encouraged to prepare a narrative. That means a document that explains your pay gap, and then more importantly, sets out the steps you're proposing to take to close or address that pay gap. And then you have to upload the data to a government portal, so it's hosted centrally, but you also have to place it on your corporate website, and you have to keep it there for 3 years. The government intended that you would be able to draw comparisons, so look at previous reports, look at previous promises made, and see whether those things are making a difference. We're into our 3rd year since we've had gender pay gap reporting, but it has been slightly impacted by COVID. So because we take an April date, last year's reporting was suspended. So that wasn't directly COVID related in that the figures are from the previous year. So last year's suspended reporting was actually April 2019 figures. Some businesses voluntarily disclosed, but many didn't. And this year's data, which employers are going to have longer to provide, but it is still going to be mandatory, that is going to be COVID impacted, because that's your data from April 2020. In the UK, as many of you know, like lots of places across the world, we introduced a scheme, a furlough scheme here, but a scheme where employees could remain employed, but receiving government supported pay. And for our pay gap reporting, those people on our furlough scheme won't count. They'll be removed completely because they weren't receiving their normal pay. And so what we're seeing is a really disrupted effect, so COVID disrupting that, because actually we're seeing in some cases, taking out those people on furlough closes the pay gap. There's a couple of reasons for that. Jobs that tend to have more women in them, so retail jobs, for example, you'll be taking out those people, often low paid workers, but also more women tended to ask for furlough related leave in order to do homeschooling. We've had a very prolonged period of homeschooling in the UK. More women than men asked for that. So we're not quite in the position we expected to be, where we'd have 3 years of data to make a comparison. But even though we don't have that, there's increased pressure on the government to bring in more pay gap reporting, particularly around ethnicity pay gap reporting. About 2 years ago, the government had a consultation. They looked at the challenges with ethnicity pay gap reporting, how you would categorize people, whether you would just be looking at a pay gap which was essentially white versus all other ethnic minorities, or whether you wanted to create a more nuanced report and where the value of those things were. And Black Lives Matters has really re-energized the discussion about reporting in that way. We're expecting the government to respond. We're expecting ethnicity pay reporting to come in the UK. And then that's also leading to pressure in relation to other reporting, just general data, not about pay gaps. So there's increasing pressure in the UK that businesses that made a lot of redundancies, for example, during COVID, should have to report the diversity impact of those, so the gender impact, the percentage of men and women who've lost their jobs, but also other protected characteristics. So though we're quite an early stage in our data and diversity transparency in the UK, it's increasingly seen as a really important tool to driving change and driving greater diversity in the workforce. I don't know, Dawn, is it the same in the US? What are employers in the US having to do to identify and fix pay equality?
Mute here. Yeah, Lucy, it's interesting that you say that there's, this reporting, because we don't have the same thing in the US. There are some employers who are reporting that kind of data, and it's putting pressure on other employers in the same industry, but it's not required. Pay equity has been a hot topic over the last few years, fueled by our national social movements, including the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, like Herbert talked about. California recently passed a law that requires employers to file these equal pay reports that you're talking about, Lucy. And California is usually sort of our a progressive state in protecting employees. And so that may be a trend in the US coming forward, but that reporting starts this month. So we'll see what happens with that. Colorado and a dozen of other states have also passed or either are considering passing pay transparency bills. And I think that that's going to be the trend. That's going to be a snowball effect here. I think one of the best practices that employers are implementing in the US are conducting pay equity audits, which are similar to what you were talking about, but meaning comparing the pay of employees that are doing like work for like work. For example, men to women in your organization, and not just individuals who have the same job title, but individuals that might be performing the same types of work, and understanding and ensuring that those people are being paid equally, because we do have an Equal Pay Act here in the US, and that's becoming more and more one of the causes of action that we're seeing that's being brought in cases. And so I think that's what we'll see more of in the US, or these pay equity analysis, and then the changes in pay to ensure that there's parity in pay going forward.
Really interesting that we can feel so similar but be so different in so many ways. Herbert, is it the same in Canada? Is the legislation in Canada addressing these kind of pay gap issues?
It's actually fascinating hearing from the experiences from both Dawn and yourself in the UK and the US, because Canada has also similar types of legislation in place for both pay transparency and also pay equity. I guess fundamentally, we have to backtrack a bit. Like the US, the Canadian system, employment is regulated mostly by the provinces. So we have 10 provinces, there's 10 sets of labor and employment laws. The federal government also legislates certain federally regulated industries, and it represents about 10% of the entire workforce, but they are a large 10%. They include the banks, the airlines, telecommunications. So breaking that all down, for the private sector, there's only 2 provinces that actually have pay equity legislation. That's Ontario and Quebec. And the pay equity legislation is similar to what Dawn sort of described. It's to value, is first there's a requirement for private sector employers that employ more than 10 employees in Ontario to categorize their jobs and to determine whether or not female-dominated jobs are paid equitably compared to male-dominated jobs. So there needs to be an analysis done, comparing the skills, the responsibilities of the 2 different types of jobs, and to determine whether or not there is a difference in pay. And if there is a difference in pay, there is a requirement under the Pay Equity Act in Ontario to equalize the pay. This legislation is actually fairly old. It's been around since the mid-90s. And the problem that we find is that there's not much enforcement of this. It's outside of the public sector or the heavily unionized sectors, there's limited enforcement of this legislation. The federal government has actually also announced a similar pay equity legislation for the federally regulated industries as well. So that's the pay equity component. Pay transparency, there's been movement on that front, and it's sort of similar to what Lucy described. In Ontario in 2018, the former provincial government implemented a Pay Transparency Act, which required employers to advertise the rates of pay for each job, prohibits reprisals against employees from discussing or disclosing compensations, and ultimately requires some sort of reporting mechanism to the government with respect to pay and gender. That's based on regulations that have never been released, and the current government has put that entire piece of legislation in abeyance. It's pending public consultations, and it's been in public consultations for about 2 years. It doesn't appear that there's any movement on this legislation or any of these requirements right now. With respect to the federal government, as of January of this year, there is a requirement in the federally regulated sphere to have similar types of reporting for pay transparency. So that's the Canadian experience.
Thank you. Now, Fadi, I know that like us, you have equal pay or pay equity rules, but I also know that you've introduced recently some similar type of gender pay gap reporting. And I know that includes a little bit of name and shaming. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that and the impact of it.
Yeah, well, actually, I think we followed your example, Lucy. We followed the UK on this one. We've had a legislation regarding an obligation to negotiate on professional equality between men and women for years, for more than 10 years. And let's face it, hasn't improved as much as we wish it would. So in 2019, the government really introduced a shift indeed and introduced a gender pay gap report that's quite similar to what you described. So it's being published every year on March 1st. So of course, the date has been chosen on purpose. It's 1 week before the International Women's Day. And it's for all companies above 50 employees. And you have 4 metrics. It's the wage spread between men and women, of course. But not only that, you also have the spread in promotion and raises, the number of promotion and raises, and also the number of employees or female employees who got a raise when they came back from maternity leave. That's an obligation to give them the raise they would have had if they had been in the company at that time. And also parity amongst the 10 highest paid persons in the company. So those are the 4 metrics. And you have every year, quite similar to what is going on in the UK, you have to publish a grade. The grade is over 100. And if you are below 75, you have to implement corrective measures. And if you don't, then you are liable for a penalty that's up to 1% of the gross wages. So it's a huge penalty. And companies also have been using that tool to, of course, improve their communication and make public release of information regarding how great they are about professional equality between men and women. And you also have to give the grade to the Ministry of Labor. And actually, you can go on the website and check the grade that everyone got. Every company's grade is publicly available. And there's a project to actually make available to the general public, not only the grade, but the calculation method of the grade. So even more information available out of transparency.
Thank you, thanks. And Dawn, it's probably in view of time to come to you, but it's quite interesting background as we look at whether COVID has had a net impact on women, looking at some of these pay-related issues.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. I mean, this is all very interesting to me and provides a lot of good information that we can use here in the US. But in terms of COVID's impact on women in the workplace, I mean, really the economic devastation that's been caused by the coronavirus has hit women particularly hard across the world. And it's being dubbed as the women's recession, if you haven't already heard that, with the latest employment figures showing due to COVID that women by a 10-point margin have seen the majority of job losses large parts of the economy across the globe as things have shut down. The gendered nature of work, I think Lucy mentioned this early on, across industries explains, much of the difference in the job rate losses for men versus women. Women are disproportionately represented in industries that have declined or either have been rendered extinct as a result of COVID in 2020 and 2021. You can imagine that women make up the majority of workers are business owners in service industries, from clothing stores to gift and novelty stores to souvenir stores and retail, the retail industry, the beauty industry, personal care. All of that has been rendered almost extinct in terms of those services being provided because of social distancing, making that prohibited. Also, the lack of systematic progress to resolve societal barriers for women explains some of the reduction in women in businesses across the world. Studies in France and the UK have shown that 70% of women are leaving the workplace for homeschooling, especially during the beginning of COVID. More of that's been taken by women than men. The caregiving crisis that women face throughout the world, it's real, it's tangible, and it's really only been exacerbated by the pandemic, with many schools closing, daycare centers closing, extended care centers closing. And mothers are 3 times as likely as fathers to be responsible for the majority of housework and childcare during COVID-19. That's even when both spouses work full time. Married women with full-time jobs still provide about 60% of the child care. And for the single mom or the single dad, it's really just been devastating, with upwards of 15 million single mothers in the United States alone being severely impacted, with very little potential for receiving any other sources of income at all, or getting a new job during this crisis. So this has been like an ongoing issue. And one of the Canadian studies that Herbert sent was very interesting to me, was seeing a huge spike, likely due to the high ratio of women working as frontline workers in healthcare services or caregivers or cleaning. But they're seeing a huge spike in COVID-19 cases for women, which is again taking them out of the workplace because of the essential roles that they are performing. So these women, interestingly enough, are not being replaced by women as our economies open up. I looked at some of the information about our transportation and warehouse industries, which provides a huge amount of jobs, like the Amazon fulfillment centers, where women accounted for approximately 20% or 26% of the workers. But when you looked at the statistics, they account for 146% of the job losses. And I peeled that back and thought, well, how could that be? And that's because as the jobs are being added, then men are taking those jobs as the new jobs are being added to replace the women. And so that's why that statistic is so high. So between 7.8 and 8.4 million women in the US filed for unemployment assistance in the 3 weeks ending April 4th of 2020. And in Canada, they've seen a huge increase. 63% of a million jobs that were lost in March of 2020 were performed by women. And so I think that, the challenge is going to be for employers going forward is, how do we get these women back in the workplace? Because even with the telecommuting systems, the statistics are showing that 22% of female workers compared to 28% of male workers. This is studies in both the UK and the US found that women were less secure in their jobs, and then they had more part-time employment that was being taken away than others. And even when they can work from home, they're being disproportionately passed over for promotions. There was a study at the end of 2020 that showed that 34% of men working remotely with children at home reported receiving a promotion versus just 9%. That's 34 to 9% of women in that same situation. So this is only exacerbated if you look at the statistics related to women of color. And so what does all of this mean for our economy and the gains that corporations employing women in the workplace have already made or experienced? I think once that things do reopen, it's going to be very difficult for mothers and caregivers and women in general who exited the labor force to find work. For example, one experiment found that job applicants with relevant experience who are out of work for more than 6 months, which, you know, this COVID-19 has gone on for almost a year now. But if the job applicant's out of work for more than 6 months, they're less likely to be called back than those with no relevant job experience for that job at all. That's going to be really tough. And so this is compounded by the fact that mothers, and especially mothers of color, are being treated in a biased way, sort of the way that Herbert was talking about, where we've already had these hard-won progress towards closing the gender gap, and that is projected to be set back decades. One study found that a woman who takes off just 1 year out of the workforce had annual earnings that were 39% lower than those of women who did not. And so we know that we've got more than a year already. So it's anticipated that the COVID setback is going to impact women in terms of being left behind much more so than it will men in terms of pay and promotion. And so businesses are going to have to pivot, become more aware of the importance of hiring and retaining and promoting women, and going to, you know, some of the ideas that sort of Fatty was talking about in terms of these neutral resumes, so that we're not engaging in unconscious bias. Also, I've already seen that employers are responding to the needs of women by adopting more flexible work schedules and telecommuting options. As of March, the beginning of March, 105 countries had passed physical response packages equivalent to US 4.8 trillion, and a total of 106 countries had introduced or adapted some type of social protection and jobs programs in response to COVID-19. And so that's going to have to continue happening. And beyond this, there needs to be a range of economic policies for both the immediate response and the long-term recovery in order to ensure that there's not going to be these significant barriers for women that will prevent them from being full partners in economic activities, ensuring equal pay and equal opportunities for work. So I'll stop there and in light of our time and go to some questions, because I'd be interested to hear what's happening in other countries. Lucy, I'll go to you first. I know that there's been some research in the UK on these topics, and there's been some involvement with Parliament and some alignment on these issues. What's happening in your sphere?
Yeah, very similar. You've highlighted some of that research, and there's a real kind of irony or frustration that actually immediately before COVID, we'd reached the highest female participation in the workforce ever at 72%. It's really challenging. But answering quickly, what the Women Inequalities group of the UK government have asked them to do is ensure that the investment in government investment in recovery is not skewed towards male-dominated industries or sectors. In other words, we're not just creating jobs for more men. That's the first thing. Looking at creating greater flexibility, your point about the people having to step out for caring responsibilities, it will be a while before schools are unrestricted. So asking for flexibility to be a day one right. In other words, no period of service to ask to do a job flexibly. And the other thing that they're asking for is better protection than we've got in the UK for pregnant mothers and new mothers. There's no prohibition like there is in some particularly European countries on making people redundant if they're pregnant. So those are likely to be the area of focus to address this.
That's great. We're moving in the right direction. Herbert, I'll ask you very quickly, maybe one thing that is happening in Canada as a result of, the crisis that we're facing with women in the workplace related to COVID-19?
Sure. I'll be pretty quick because Dawn, you've echoed a lot of my remarks as well, because the Canadian experience is very similar to the U.S. The women in the workforce has been disproportionately affected by COVID because they predominantly work. There's a greater percentage of women working in service industries, the food service industries, the accommodation industries, which are typically lower paid in the first place. So COVID has resulted in an exacerbation of pay gaps as well as a whole. Similarly, if workers who are working at home have the fortunate position of working from home, women workers have statistically borne the brunt of the childcare obligations, and therefore there has been the participation rates of women are dropping because women are electing to leave the workforce for childcare obligations because of schools were shut down in Canada for a while, daycares were shut down. This is another unfortunate statistics. And finally, the federal government in Canada did announce very recently that there will be a task force for women in the economy, and the mandate of this task force is to advise the finance minister on any potential solutions or recommendations to address the gender imbalances that have resulted from COVID. So we'll wait to see what those recommendations are.
That's great. It'll be interesting to hear about that. Patty, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for affirmative action. If you want to make some comments related to, what's happening in France with women, go ahead and do that.
Yeah, actually, I'll go fast on the gender impact of COVID-19 in France, because actually we lack distance on this. So, but the findings we have, especially from a survey from one of the unions in France, is exactly the same as in other countries, unfortunately. So I'll skip on that, and I'll move ahead right away to affirmative action and and how you can use affirmative action. That's in France a very difficult topic, because actually, technically speaking, affirmative action is not really allowed in France. Actually, racial criteria are not possible. And that was the exact same reason as I mentioned earlier. We do not do statistics based on ethnicity at a national level, and our constitution prohibits making a difference between citizens based on ethnicity. Now, there are ways to go around that. And I think we have three exceptions which we can mention. The first one, as mentioned in the slide, is based on geographical criterion. That's allowed. And it has been implemented for the place of study to favor students from underprivileged suburban areas to enter into a famous political science school, which is called Sciences Po. And students coming from underprivileged areas had a quota for their applications. So that's something that's been going on for years, and it's been a subject of debate, but now it's fairly well accepted. And it's being, I read in the press yesterday, actually, that the government wanted to do exactly the same for the exam to enter, to become a public servant, the highest type of public servant. They also want to include a quota based on the place of residence to favor those coming from underprivileged areas. So that's the first thing, and I think that's the only, the thing that is the closest to affirmative action in France. Secondly, we have an obligation to have handicapped workers in the workplace. There's a quota of 6% of handicapped workers. Now, in practice, companies do not often have 6% of handicapped workers in the workplace. So they can implement alternative measures. They can use a company which uses handicapped workers or employs handicapped workers, or they can pay a contribution instead. So not sure whether that would qualify as affirmative action as you would describe it. But that's the way it is, and companies are encouraged to improve how they address the employment of handicapped workers in the workplace. Most recently, an obligation was implemented in the electoral code and in the labor code to have a strict equality between men and women and candidate lists for national elections, as well as for professional elections. So for national elections, I'll go fast on this. It's just an election where you can actually elect 2 persons instead of 1, with larger areas. And those 2 persons will obviously be 1 man and 1 woman. For professional elections within the workplace, the rule is that men and women must be presented in alternation on candidate lists for the list to be valid, and the number of men and women on the list must correspond to the proportion of men and women among the electoral pool. If you have 70% women in the company, you will need to have 70% women on the list. And you'll present the candidates in alternation, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 man, and then of course if you have 10 candidates, of course the 3 men will be first, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 man, 1 woman, and then you'll have the 7 women at the end of the list. So that's a tool that's been implemented a few years ago to favor equality between men and women in the workplace as well. And now, in practice, we found that although it was a good idea and it's still live, unions have had problems to apply the rule in practice because they've had issues finding interested candidates of both genders, and in most instances, women, to apply to become an employee rep. In fact, in practice, women sometimes didn't want to be an employee rep, which was a problem for the unions to present a complete list. And in the end, what happened is that in some companies and in some instances, we ended up with no candidate at all because they couldn't put an additional man on the list, which means that in the end, we had less elected representative than under the previous rules. So that's for France on affirmative action. And I think that turning to you, Lucy, in the UK part, I know that this is also a problematic question for you in the UK. So what would your tip-tops be on the UK part?
Yeah, very similar to you. And I'll be quick because I think there's a much more interesting comparison with what's possible in the US and Canada. And actually, for people that are interested, there's an article about what we call positive action that we can share off this on Ius Laboris, and also a podcast. The critical things I'd say is that quotas are very, very difficult in the UK. We would generally advise that the use of a quota is going to be unlawful. So you should really be looking at targets, not quotas, and looking at the steps, particularly on recruitment and promotion, you can take to ensure that you're reaching the biggest possible pool of candidates. And some things will always be allowed. So we say, for example, an equality audit of your recruitment criteria, the questions you're going to ask in interview, the assessment you're going to do, all of that will always be lawful. But as you say, affirmative action or positive action is very, very difficult in the UK, and we'll share the article we've written on that to allow time to go to Dawn, I think, where it's more interesting.
Yes, Dawn, thank you, Lucy. Turning to you, Dawn, so how are private employers increasing diversity through use of diverse slates?
So it's interesting, you know, in the US, I mean, we have both affirmative action as well as voluntary affirmative action. So affirmative action, you can be required to have an affirmative action plan if you're an employer over a certain level, or if there's some type of remedial action that you're being required to engage in as a result of some type of lawsuit or a claim that's been filed with our Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of employers do in the US is where they have no mandated affirmative action, they develop these voluntary affirmative action plans, or a voluntary plan, which is really usually your diversity plan to diversify your workplace. There's a 3-step analysis that's required where you have to do a self-analysis of your workplace. There has to be a reasonable basis for concluding that affirmative action is appropriate, and then reasonable action. And that reasonable action, what a lot of employers are doing are following what they're calling the Rooney Rule or the Mansfield Rule as that reasonable action. And the rules generally require consideration of at least 1 or 2 in the case of the Rooney Rule, and at least 30% in the case of the Mansfield Rule of any group of candidates that are being considered for a particular position to be diverse. And that diverse slate, or requiring that diverse slate, has been found to result in the selection of more diverse candidates, because it helps to mitigate against what Herbert really started at, which sort of is bringing us full circle, is this bias, the similarity bias, or this natural inclination to surround ourselves with people who look like us and think like us and act like us. And so by mitigating that similarity bias, companies can improve gender and race and ethnicity. And I know you can look up the Rooney Rule, which was popular. It was popular by the NFL in 2003, but the Mansfield Rule, which some of you may not know, is named for Arabella Babs Mansfield, who was the first woman to pass the bar and be admitted to practice law in the US. And that's really taken hold in a lot of law firms and companies, where there's a requirement that you consider 30% women and minorities for any leadership position or higher level position, which is resulting in more women in the workplace and hopefully will offset some of the COVID issues.
Thank you, Dawn. We'll move to you, Herbert, with a few minutes we have left.
For sure.
Tell us if there are any jurisdictions in Canada where you can impose or that impose any sort of discriminative affirmative action. Sorry.
So it's interesting, like listening to the European examples and Dawn's the U.S. example. In Canada, like there's only one jurisdiction where there is a requirement for, it's a type of affirmative action. It's the federal jurisdiction. And again, going back to what I earlier spoke about, that represents about 10% of the workforce, but 10% of very large employers. So how the Employment Equity Act requires employers that employ more than 100 employees to report on a yearly basis the split of men, women, Aboriginals, Aboriginal persons, persons with disabilities, and persons who are members of visible minorities. So you're required to keep statistics, and these statistics are broken down into within wage categories, like how many high wage earners fall into these categories, how many new hires fall into these categories, how many employees you've promoted fall into these categories, and how many employees you've terminated fall into these categories. So there's an actual reporting requirement for employers within the federal sphere. Also, the Act requires employers to determine whether their employment complement underrepresents people that fall under these categories with the Canadian workforce in general, or with segments of the workforce that are identifiable to the qualifications and eligibility or geography of that position. So there, oftentimes employers would keep statistics of what the Canadian workforce as a whole have for, say, racialized candidates. Say it's 40% in that geographic area are racialized. Does the employer have 40% of their new hires? Are they from a racialized group? So if there is an underrepresentation, there's a requirement under the Act that employers must review their employment policies and identify any issues that may be causing barriers for against the hiring of a representative number of these type of people falling under these various groups. So this sort of brings us into a full circle, actually, about collecting data and addressing any unconscious biases or disproportional representation within the workforce. But in Canada, it's only for the federal jurisdiction that this requirement, there's such requirement.
Thank you, Herbert. I think we are out of time for questions, unfortunately. Maybe I'll hand over to you, Annie, with regards to a few housekeeping items you wanted to mention.
Yes, thank you, Fadi. So unfortunately, today we didn't have the time to take some of the questions that we had, but the panelists can maybe get back to the attendees on those by email. I make sure of that. So for more information about today's topic, I advise you to check out our diversity inclusion series page that we have on our website available, where we keep several interesting resources. So all of the topics that were touched today, you will find more on those on this page. And for more information on our webinar and podcast series, you can go to these links that I've included here. So on our website, we keep all of our past recordings and also the slide decks, so you can download them from there. So thank you everyone for attending today, and thanks also for our amazing panelists for their insights. So with that, this webinar will now be ending. Thank you all.